Hey there, I'm Alex, and welcome to episode 6 of the ComfyUI for VFX series. Today I'm going to be talking about LoRAs and how to implement them on your text-to-image and image-to-image workflows. LoRAs are a way of fine-tuning a larger model without having to retrain the whole model. Instead of changing every parameter, what the LoRA does is that it introduces small adjustments to an existing model, making it specialize in a specific look or style or character or object with a lot less training time than having to do a model from scratch. So we're going to be covering LoRAs today for SDXL and FLUX, and you're going to see with how very little effort you can take one image into a wildly different style just with the help of LoRAs. Alternatively, like I said, you can also use LoRAs to get character continuity. There's a lot of things you can do with LoRAs. So take this as a very baseline, very introductions of what LoRAs are and what they can do. And then by the end of the video, hopefully you'll feel more comfortable when you hear the term LoRA thrown around. All right, let's get started. Now that you understand what LoRAs are, I wanted to show you where to get them, of course. So as usual, we're going to be going to civitai.com. And from here, it's actually quite straightforward. You want to go into the models section here at the top left. And then once that loads, you want to go to the top right, open the filters tab. And from here, you're going to select LoRA. And then you also want to select what model it's going to be for. In my example, I'm going to be showing you, in the examples I'm going to be covering today, I'm going to show you how to build it for, as usual, SDXL and FLUX. So you can just filter it that way. And once you have that filtered, everything that's going to show is the LoRA specific for that model. Once you find a LoRA you like, you can just go ahead and click on it. In my case, I'm going to be using the ink style here. As you can see here on the top left, it's going to tell you specifically for what model you're browsing. This is the SDXL version, but you also have FLUX and SD 1.5 if it's something you wanted. And it's going to show you a gallery of examples of what you can expect your outputs to be with the LoRA. Another important thing with LoRAs is that not only do they have to be compatible with the model, so like it says here again, SDXL, but it sometimes has extra information. So if you browse down here, you say show more, sometimes the person that trained the LoRA will give you suggestions on how to use it. Normally you can just download it, keep it at a strength of 1, and it should do fine. But if you're encountering issues, make sure you come back to the site where you downloaded it from and read through the instructions from the author. Another important thing when it comes to LoRAs is trigger words. So you can see here it says trigger words and it gives you a couple. What this means is that you have to make sure that you add the trigger words to your prompts when you're back in ComfyUI. It's sort of a way of calling upon the LoRA to do its thing when you add the trigger words. If you don't, it probably is not going to work correctly because that's not the way it was trained. Once you're happy, if it's a LoRA you're going to actually be getting and trying out for yourself, you can just go to the top right, just like you do any other model. You can click the download button. Once you download the LoRA, you want to go back into your ComfyUI installation. So in my case, in the F drive, ComfyUI Windows Portable, and then I'm going to go into the ComfyUI folder. In here, I'm going to go into models, and then from models, you want to look for LoRAs. Once you're in LoRAs, I recommend you split them in folders like I have here. So I've already downloaded a few that I wanted to show you today, and then same thing for FLUX. If I open here, you see I have LoRAs downloaded. This makes it easier so that when you're browsing your LoRAs inside of ComfyUI, if they live in model-specific folders, it's going to make it easier for you to know what LoRAs are compatible with what model. Once you've downloaded and installed your LoRA, you want to go ahead and launch ComfyUI like I have here. And in my case, I'm going to be opening the workflow from episode 3, which is the SDXL text-to-image workflow. Keep in mind that if you did download the LoRA while you still had ComfyUI running, you don't have to relaunch Comfy. You can just use the R hotkey, so that'll refresh, as you can see on the top right here. It'll just refresh and look for new models on your folders. Alternatively, you can just navigate to the edit menu in the top left, and then from here you can just say refresh node definitions. And once you click that, it'll just rescan your folders and make sure that you're looking at the latest and greatest of what's inside your models and LoRAs folder. So now that I have my episode 3 SDXL text-to-image workflow up and running, first thing I'm going to go ahead and do so I don't mess things up is going to go into the workflow menu, the top left, and I'm going to say save as, and then from here I'm going to rename it to episode 6. I'm going to leave it SDXL and get rid of the last part here and just call it LoRA. So that way we have a bit of a different starting point and I make sure that I'm not messing up my already saved workflow from before. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and start rebuilding our workflow so that it's now working with LoRAs. The first thing you're going to need is actually a load LoRA node. So you can look for load LoRA, be right here. And then there's a few, but you can just grab the vanilla Comfy core node and that should do it for you. And then as you can see, the load LoRA has a few inputs. So you can input a model and you need to input a clip and then on the other end, it outputs a model and a clip. So once you have that in your Comfy workflow, I'm going to start giving some of these things a bit more space and proceed to connect it in the following way. So I'm going to go directly into my load checkpoint node, and because it has an input of model, I'm going to go ahead and connect the model to model, the clip to clip, and then from here, I'm going to go ahead and connect the model to our set node and the clip to our clip. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for both my positive and my negative clips. I'm going to go ahead and move the VAE down here just so that the wires don't necessarily cross. And because of the way we built this with the set get nodes, there is a bit of an unfortunate issue, or maybe there's a solution to it. I don't know it. I'm going to show you a way around it that I use, which is not the prettiest thing in the world. But the nice thing about Comfy is that you have that bypass node. So if I'm going to zoom in here, and if I right click any node, I can always go down here and say bypass, and that'll turn our node purple, essentially ignoring that node. If I do that with set get nodes, it's going to give you an error. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and select my node again and hit Control B so that I get rid of the bypass. But just know that that will be an issue in a minute when I try to do something that I should be able to, but I am not at the moment. Okay, we have our load LoRa node, and like I said, it's much easier for you to have LoRas that are already living inside model specific names. So in this case, I renamed my folders Flux and SDXL so that if you're in SDXL workflow like we are here, if you select the Flux LoRa, well, you know that you're probably doing something wrong. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and select an SDXL LoRa, in this case, the glow neon LoRa. Before I do anything else, I actually want to show you something so that we have a baseline to compare. So I'm going to go ahead and reconnect my model to my set model node, and I'm going to essentially ignore this load LoRa node for now. And then the clips, I'm going to connect directly from the load checkpoint node. And now our load LoRa is there, but it's not really doing anything. Here in my positive prompt, I'm going to go ahead and type something, let's keep it simple, something like motorcycle. Set motorcycle. The other thing I want to go ahead and do is set this to fixed so that our seed isn't constantly changing. And I'm going to go ahead and cue this just so that we have a starting point that we can start working from, and so that we can always go back to the image that we had when we started. So in this case, we have our motorcycle here. Maybe let's generate a few more. So I think I like this new one that we're getting here in the preview. Let's see what that looks like. Yes, so much better. So I like this motorcycle. So let's go ahead and keep it. And again, my old name. So I'm just gonna rename this to SDXL LoRA. Just for my control. So once I have that in place, right, we now, if I go ahead and try to requeue the workflow, you see nothing happens because my seed is fixed, which is a good thing. So that way I can always come back to this image if I wanted. I can go ahead and do my reconnections here on the load LoRa node. So again, I'm going to connect the model to the set model and then clips directly to positive and negative from the load LoRa model. And as you can see here, the name of the LoRa is glow neon. So I'm going to go here in my tabs, find the glow neon LoRa for SDXL. And like I said before, I'm going to go look for some trigger words. So I make sure that this is working as expected. So you can use one, you can use multiple, depending on what the LoRa is. I'm just going to use one for now. So this glow neon, you can just click on this little button and it'll make a copy on your clipboard. So that way you can just navigate back to your ComfyUI and easily go into your prompt. And I always like adding the LoRa trigger word at the beginning. So I'm just going to say glow neon, comma, space, and then motorcycle. Remember, we kept our seed fixed. So that means that like if I generated before, nothing was going to happen. But because the LoRa is coming in and giving the model that new information, it of course has to take that into account. So if I click Q now, what you'll see is that it, of course, even though the seed was locked because that new information is in, it's going to go ahead and give us a new image. And if I go ahead and bring in a load image node and drop in that image that we had generated originally, so this is the exact same seed as you can see, but we're getting very different images. It's not really a reshading of your image. That comes later when we're talking about image to image and LoRas. So you can see we have our original image with the same seed, and we get something that's very different but sticks to our LoRa's look. So again, I'm gonna go back here to the glow neon LoRa website, and you can see this makes sense now that we see it, right? So it's trying to give you that style of image with the prompt, and then not necessarily retaining the original image. So we'll get to that in a bit. So I'm going to circle back here again, and now I'm going to go ahead and select another LoRa just so I can show you how you can very quickly with a LoRa change how things look and behave within a model. So I'm going to go ahead and now let's say I'm going to select this one, which is, I believe, a fractal LoRa that I downloaded. This is the LoRa that I'm going to be using now, the fractal geometry style. And as you can see, the trigger word is here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it, come back to Comfy, delete the original trigger word for the other LoRa. And if I run this now, we're going to get, again, a motorcycle, but it's going to be in the style of the fractal geometry LoRa that we downloaded. You see, we get a very aggressive difference from what we had before, and that's just because the LoRa is driving it. So you have control over how strong that LoRa is. However, this behaves very differently from LoRa to LoRa, which is why, as I was saying, always definitely go ahead and read any extra information that the author is putting on their LoRas. But again, you'll get a feel for them the more you use a LoRa. So I usually keep it at 1 because I'm looking for a look when I'm doing text to image. When it comes to image, it might be something you want to dial in as you want to give more or less strength. If you go past 1, you can start getting weird results, especially when you start getting closer to 1.5 or 2. So you can go to something like 1.2 and maybe some LoRas will behave properly, but I'd recommend you stay within 1. I imagine it's going to be fine. Yeah, it's going to be fine. Things start to get a bit crunchy, contrasty sometimes, and then all out break. So just something to keep in mind. And if you want to go lower, so in my case, I just went 0.5, what you're going to see is that, you know, we are going to get a lot of that weirdness that was going on in the background. It's going to stick strictly to the bike, and it's, you know, maybe even respecting some areas. So again, it'll take some back and forth with each LoRa for you to get used to how this works. Now I'm going to go ahead and use another one. So this is a pretty fun one. If I show you the original website here, it's going to be this one. So it's a Wizards vintage comic book cover. And I'm going to go ahead and copy one of the trigger words, and then come back here and say, keep the motorcycle prompt, but in this case, vintage comic book. And I'm going to go ahead and cue that. And I probably should actually bump this to 1. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that generation and then requeue. And then you'll see in the preview here, we're getting something that looks similar to the training data. So if we go back to the examples that they have here, you know, this is more or less the stuff you can expect, right? So if I go ahead and maybe let's just change the seed by 1 number, so we get something a bit different. You see, we get motorcycle and in the style of that LoRa. So yeah, this is pretty neat. Finally, the last one for the SDXL that I want to show you is the Chinese ink. If I go here and look for the ink style, this is the one we were talking about before. I can go ahead and copy the trigger word. So in this case, I'm going to copy it here, then come back to Comfy, remove the vintage comic book and add the new trigger word for this specific LoRa, strength set to 1. And now what you'll see is that we are going to get an image of a motorcycle, but this time it's going to look like an ink painting. So if we go back to the ink style here, this more or less matches what we were expecting. Now that we've done that, the issue I wanted to show you before is that you should be able to just have a load LoRa node in your workflows, and then with Control B with the node selected, you're going to be able to disable that. However, if I queue this now, like I was saying, it's going to give you an error. It's going to tell you that it's not finding the model which this node is looking for, right? That's a bit annoying. You have a couple options, right? Because it's always nice to have the option of having LoRas within a workflow if it's something that you're going to be, like I said, we've built workflows in a way that things are modular, right? So that you can start adding to them. We started with the basics of text to image, then image to image, but you want to start having all of those options within a workflow. LoRas is something that you're going to be using over and over, especially when you start talking about training your own for a specific project. The options you have here is, let's go ahead and disable that and re-enable that node for now. Like I said, it's a bit annoying that it just doesn't bypass it and continue the pipe through even if I'm bypassing the node, but you have an option. So you can either connect directly from the load LoRa into the model. And if I go ahead and disable this node now, it will work because it's not going through the set get nodes for the model specifically. So see, that's running. So that's running. And you see, even though we have our LoRa node connected, it's not doing anything. It's not in that Chinese ink style because it's disabled. So how can we make this work with the set get nodes, right? Because they're nice and comfortable and they can make things organized. It starts to get a bit convoluted, but I figured because I ran into this issue, I'm going to share with you how I fix it and how I do it on my workflows whenever I want to still use the set get nodes. Again, if anyone knows a more elegant way of doing this, by all means reach out because it's something that I'd really like to know. So I'm going to go ahead and re-enable this and rerun the image, make sure that everything's piped correctly. It looks like it is. Then let's just look at the result here. Okay, so we're good. We're back to where we were. So if I wanted to have this workflow with the setget nodes and still have access to turning on or off a LoRa, this is how I would do it. And keep in mind that even though if I say here, right, if I bring this down to 0, if I generate again, you'd think that keeping the strength at 0 would essentially ignore that LoRa, but it doesn't seem like it does, right? Like it's just giving us something different. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it back to 1 here, the strength, and I'm gonna bring in another node. So I'm gonna say switch. You're gonna select the first option that I have here, switch any. And what this does is you're gonna be inputting different inputs. So in my case, the first input I want to connect here is the base model, right? So that's gonna be my input 1. And then I'm going to input the model coming out of the LoRa loader. So now I have 2 inputs, right? And let's go ahead and give these nodes a bit of space and reorganize my nodes here. And this way, what you're going to be connecting for the set node of the model is not going to be the load LoRa, because that breaks if we disable it. It's going to be this output instead. It behaves just like you would imagine. You select what input you want to execute, and it's going to just rewire things in that way. So I'm going to do that for this. And because we need to do it for the clip as well, I'm going to bring in another switch node. So another switch any node. And then I'm going to select for the first input, I'm going to connect it directly from the load checkpoint. And then for the clip, I'm going to select it from the load LoRa node. And then from here, I can just go ahead and connect my clips, positive and negative, and that should more or less do it. So I'm going to give some space here just so I can read where those wires are coming from. I'm going to do the same for the model here. And there we go. So now we've set it up in a way where we have our base model. So if at any point we wanted to use our base model, all you need to do is set the input to 1 on both of these, right? So if I go ahead and run this now with this set to 1, and let me get rid of that trigger word just so that we don't confuse anything. If I run this now, then it's going to generate an image for us, right? So there we have it. We have our motorcycle. And then if I go ahead and set this to 2, right, and run it again, we're going to get something that's actually going through the LoRa loader, because the LoRa loader is using the second input for both of those switches. You don't necessarily need to enable or disable the node anymore. Now it's all controlled through a switch. So I'd rather have it be that I could enable or disable, but if, at least at the moment and to my knowledge, if you want to do it this way, if you want to do it by disabling a node, then you're going to have to potentially skip using the setget node for the model. So now if we look at our output here, oh, looks like I forgot the trigger word. I'm going to go ahead and add that and rerun it. And now we have an output that hopefully looks like our ink LoRa. And again, if I want to go ahead and redo that, I'm going to go ahead and go back to 1. So this is going to be just raw model with no LoRa. That's going to give us an output. And that's including the trigger word. I just left it in to see what comes out. So this is the raw output. And then if I go back to 2 and I rerun this, you'll see we get our ink motorcycle once again. So there you have it. I'm going to go ahead and reorganize here my script. Everything is now in place, and this now behaves as we expected. Now that we have our workflow wired and working with or without LoRas through these switch models, I want to show you how to also take advantage of using it as a image-to-image workflow. And it looks like I made a mistake here because I just kept the model connected through directly. But again, I can just now use my get node. And if I run this, I'm going to get an output that looks the same, just because it's the same seed. So you see nothing changed. So now it is properly connected. Apologies for that. So, okay, how do we bring in an image? So you know the first thing we do, you can of course go into your SDXL image to image and just copy those nodes over, but I'm going to do it quickly here. So I'm going to say load image, right? So that's the first thing we're going to need. And then actually in this case, we can actually use the one we were using before. So let's say this is a motorcycle that we got from, let's say, a client, right? And for this image, we want to apply different LoRas to it, but we want to retain as much as the original image as possible. What you need to do, as you know, is we're going to go ahead and we need to encode this into VAE. So we're going to say VAE encode, and then I'm going to get my get node, right? And I'm going to select the VAE here. So that's the nice thing about the set get nodes. Now that this is in latent space, I can go ahead and connect it to my K sampler. So we don't necessarily need to use this anymore. And again, this would be another way of you using the switch. So if I go ahead and move this down, maybe move these guys further to the left a bit, I can just use switch any node, and then I'm going to select for the latent of the empty latent image node. And then for the second option, I'm going to select my VAE encoded image that we're using here. So if I move things here a bit to the left, what you'll see is that now I can use this switch for me to select whether I want to use an empty latent image or an image that I'm loading in. So this is something that you can just have in your workflow. In this case, because our image is set to 2, it is in the input 2, I'm going to set it to 2. So now, if I go ahead and run this, because I know this is in the exact same resolution as my empty latent, so 1344, 768, this is the exact same just because it was generated through this. I don't need to worry about rescaling it for it to fit properly. I can just trust that that's going to work. If I run this now, it's going to, of course, use that encoded image as a starting point, and we're going to get something already in. So what's interesting is that if I go ahead and lower the denoise, right? So let's say like something like 0.6 and rerun it, you see we're getting something that looks much closer to our input image while being applied that LoRa that we were looking at before. Instead of me bringing this load image here to the left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select compare and select the image compare from RG3. Here, I'm going to select an image A. I'm going to select the output of our model. And then for the load image, I'm going to select the load image here. And that way I can just compare without having to move nodes around. I'm going to rewire this bit just so it's a bit neater. And now if I rerun the workflow, because it's the same seed, it's just going to load the last result. So you can see now as I compare, it's grabbing that original image and it's applying the LoRa to it. And you can more or less control how much it's being affected by the denoise value, which is what we were talking about in the previous video. If I go ahead and bump this up to something like 0.75, we're giving the model a bit more liberty of doing its thing, but it's still going to be retaining a lot of that original. But you see it starts deviating a bit, right? So it starts shrinking in places and it's just doing its own thing because we're giving it that liberty. But if we wanted it to really stick, we might want to lower it to something like 0.55. Hopefully that'll be enough for it to introduce that ink look with our bike still being intact in terms of how it's built. That's why the video from last week was so important, because understanding image to image is just the beginning of a lot of things we're going to be able to do. And you can see how very quickly we can change our image into looking something very, very different with just an input image and a LoRa. So I'm going to go ahead and now change the LoRa here. And I'm going to go ahead and select maybe that comic book one that we were looking at before. I'm going to go ahead and grab the trigger word. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. So I'm going to replace the trigger word here and I'm going to rerun that now that we have our LoRa in place. And what you'll see is that it might require some more liberty just because we're doing quite a bit to it. You see it's pretty interesting that already we get something that is already approximating to what that looks like. So I'm going to give it some more freedom, 0.75. It's going to deviate a bit, but that's okay. It's just so that we can see what the result is. And there we have it. So we have, all that stuff that is expected from the LoRa is translating nicely into our original image. I'm going to go do a couple more examples here just for you to see. I'm going to go through the last two. I'm not sure how successful this one's going to be, but I'm going to go ahead and run the fractal one, change the trigger word here and rerun it. After a few seconds, well, there's something. We'll see, we'll get something that's in that fractal world while still trying to retain our image as much as it can with the freedom we're giving it. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and select the glow neon LoRa that I had selected as well. From here, I'm going to copy the trigger word or one of the trigger words, and then replace it with the one we had before, rerun this, and you get the idea. Rinse and repeat. We're going to get something that's going to be in that style of the glow neon LoRa that we were seeing before. You see, we have our motorcycle. It's more or less retained, but we're starting to get that look from our LoRa. So you can see, you can do a lot very quickly with this, and this is, again, we're just getting started with all this image to image stuff. This is, like I said, this is where it gets fun because you start getting some more control. It's not just, a random string of words that turn into an image. You can actually start doing a lot of things with image to image. While we're on this workflow, I wanted to show you one last thing that I'm not going to be doing examples for because it's just going to take much longer than I wanted to for today, but I did want to let you know that this exists and it's out there. So if I double click here and I type LoRa, what you're going to find is that you're going to have something like the load LoRa stack here. And what this does is that this node allows you to have multiple LoRas selected at the same time. Let's say I want to have the glow neon, and for the second LoRa, I want to have, I don't know, maybe the Chinese ink style. So you can have multiple LoRas selected at the same time in one node. Alternatively, what you can do is you can have multiple load LoRa nodes chained one after another. So just like we did here, where we connect the model and the clip directly to the load LoRa, you can do this with as many nodes as you want, and then you can just enable or disable them. However, having all in one node is much more comfortable. So you can just come here and you just say, I want this to be 0, I want this to be 0.47, and then you get the idea. You can stack, in this node you can stack 4 LoRa's, and that way you can mix and match styles and get an output that is something maybe that a single LoRa can't do. So just something for you to know. Everything else connects exactly the same, but this just gives you the freedom of running more than one LoRa at the same time while still retaining the control over the strength of each. Now that we have our workflow rewired and working for LoRa's, I'm going to go ahead and move things around so that I want to go ahead and make it as organized as I can. So I'm going to grab my backdrop here, scale it so that everything fits in, and that way we now can save this again as the episode 6 SDXL LoRa workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to save it and I'm going to call that done for this workflow. So now that I have that done, I want to show you how to do the same thing for Flux workflows. So again, I'm going to open my workflows folder here. And in this case, I'm going to be looking for the episode 5 Flux Dev FP8 image to image. And once I have that in place, the wiring is going to look more or less the same. But remember, for this workflow, I did not use set get nodes. So in that sense, it's going to be a bit easier. So again, I can just go ahead and look for load LoRa node. And then once I have that, I can just add model to model, clip to clip. So that goes here. So here from clip, I'm going to go ahead and connect the positive from load LoRa node into the positive clip, and then negative to negative. So there we go. This remains the same. These dots can go, of course, because I'm just going to be connecting directly from the load LoRa node into the K sampler. We have that there. And now you see it's just like an extension of the checkpoint, which is more or less what the LoRa's are. So now we have, just organize these things a little bit here so that we don't have crossing wires. I don't like those. We can move the K sampler up so that lines are straight, and that sort of does it. So again, I'm going to go ahead with my simple prompt of motorcycle. And if I go ahead and disable this now, just so that we get a baseline, and then come here into my K sampler, I'm going to select, instead of randomize, I'm going to keep it at fixed. And before I do anything to mess my workflow up, I'm going to go here and say save as, and I'm going to give it the name episode 6 Flux Dev FP8, but in this case, I'm going to give it LoRa and save that. So now I can go ahead and save my episode 5. I don't want to save the changes I did there. And now that I have that there, I'm going to go ahead and actually add an empty latent just so that I don't mess anything up. So empty latent, we'll get to the image to image in a moment. And I'm going to connect that to my K sampler if it will allow me. And then for resolution, I'm just going to keep it at the same as we had last time. So 1344 by 768. And then I'm going to go ahead and queue this image. Now that's done, we have an image of a motorcycle, of course, as expected. And I'm actually going to go ahead and right click this image and say copy image. And then into my load image here, I'm actually going to go ahead and paste it here so that when we come back in a minute, I just can start working over this image of a motorcycle, just like we did on our SDXL workflow. So, okay, we have the image of the motorcycle here. And of course, we're comparing to the astronaut, but the denoise value was set to 1, so it's completely ignoring it. Not only that, but the empty latent was what's driving it. So actually that image wasn't even doing anything. So now I can come back here into my load LoRa node. I'm going to re-enable it with Control B. And again, you want to use those folders to help you guide what LoRa goes with what. So again, because I placed it in the Flux LoRa inside my LoRa's folder, that's why we have that Flux name ahead, which is really helpful. And I'm going to keep the CPA LoRa on. The CPA is a cyberpunk anime style LoRa. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and select so you see it has 2 trigger words, anime and cyberpunk. I'm going to go ahead and copy one of those, and then come back here, motorcycle, comma, cyberpunk, and then anime, so the 2 trigger words. And actually I'm going to keep the LoRa loader off, and I'm going to rerun that prompt with the LoRa loader off, just so that we can see what the base model is capable of doing with those 3 words, right? So we're saying motorcycle, cyberpunk, which is one of the trigger words, anime, one of the trigger words, but at this point they're just words, not trigger words, because our LoRa is off. And if we look at the result here, well, okay, yeah, we have all those cyberpunk colors, but this isn't necessarily anime or even close to it. So if I go ahead and enable our LoRa now, because it's using that cyberpunk anime LoRa, and rerun this with its trigger words enabled, of course, what you're going to see is that we're going to get something wildly different, very much in line with what it looks like on the LoRa examples. So there you have it. We have something that looks wildly different, definitely has that style. And let's go ahead and change the seed and get a couple more generations just to see what this LoRa is capable of. So you see, very, very different from what the original model can do. And that's why, again, LoRas are so powerful, because you can get something that's wildly different than what a model can do, just because it has that extra bit of training on a specific style or artist or subject. If I go back here now, right, and let's say we want to use our original bike that we had before, or that we generated originally just with the raw model, and I'm going to go ahead and connect that as the latent image for our K-sampler. And you can go ahead and do the whole switch setup that we did here for the SDXL workflow. We can actually just go ahead and do that now, just so that we have it. So I'm going to double click here. I'm going to say switch any. And then for my input 1, I want my empty latent. Input 2, I want my image input. And that way we have kind of the best of both worlds. So whenever we need one or the other, I'm going to set it to 2 because that's what my image is. And because I know that we need to give the model, we need to rein the model back a bit. I don't want it to give it full freedom. So I'm going to say 0.6. And this time I'm going to rerun it. So it's going to use our image, you see, as a starting point, and then apply all that it can from that LoRa with the amount of freedom that we're giving it. And let's see if that's enough. We might need to give it a bit more. So it looks like we definitely want to give it a bit more. So this is at a 0.6 denoise value in our K-sampler. I'm going to go ahead and bump it up to 0.75 and rerun it. So it looks like this image really struggles going through that LoRa. So if I show you the before and after, and this is at a 0.8 denoise value, see, it's adding Japanese characters to it, and it's definitely changing our image. But I don't feel like it's giving it any of that cyberpunk or anime aesthetic that the LoRa is supposed to do. So if I keep bumping this up, the issue is that we start losing our original image. It's going to start losing its structure. And we'll get to control nets in a future video, which, you know, brings you back that control. But I'm surprised that at a 0.8, it's not freedom enough for it to do its thing. So let's see at 0.85 if we get something closer to that. Okay, maybe this is already starting to get there. So we can see the quality of that hand-drawn, hand-painted image is starting to get in, but I'm surprised that it requires this much. And this is actually a great example of why you can't just plug in numbers every time. You have to try a few things until you get something that resembles what you're going for. In this case, I'm really surprised to see how much this image is fighting that LoRa back for control. So this is at 0.8, and we definitely start getting that look, but we're deviating aggressively from our image. So this is a great example and a great learning of why Comfy is something that you can't just plug a number and you get a result. You have to try different things and then arrive to the result you're looking for through trial and error. If I go back here, I'm going to go ahead and try my other FLUX LoRa. So this is called Dissolve LoRa. And if I go back here into Civit AI, you see it's like all these things are dissolving. I'm going to copy the trigger word like we always do, come back to Comfy, replace my trigger words with the new one here. And I'm going to rerun this now that I've selected that new LoRa. And I forgot to reduce the denoise, so we're going to deviate quite a bit from an image, but let's see what that gives us. So this is our image at a 0.88 denoise, so we are deviating quite a bit from our image, but you get the idea. We get that dissolve effect. And if I wanted to rein that in a bit, maybe I could just go back down to 0.65 on our denoise value. And remember, I'm keeping all my LoRas at strength 1. I usually do that, just control the LoRa effect through other methods. But if you can, you always have the freedom of going into the low LoRa node and reducing or increasing that model strength if you need it. If I look at the result now, so look interesting. So that's also not liking this very much. So you looks like you do have to go quite aggressively on these LoRas, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever you're trying to achieve. And say at a denoise of 0.9, we're going to get something definitely closer to the LoRa. But again, we could also just come in and bump that strength model on the LoRa, and that should get us there as well. So again, just different approaches to get you to more or less the destination you're going for. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what LoRas are, how you can use them, how you can leverage, and definitely go out there and read some more about it, because what I covered is honestly just scratching the surface. As you know, with everything Comfy, this is very, very extensive. There's a lot of information out there, so definitely seek it out. I'll be covering more stuff as we go on, but this is a very important one, especially for us in visual effects, where consistency is king. And like I said at the beginning, you don't have to think specifically about styles when it comes to LoRas, which is definitely the bulk of what I've covered today, but think more about it about consistency, not only in terms of style, but characters, props, objects. There's a lot you can do with LoRas. And once you can start training your own, then you'll have a lot more control over what you can expect from a LoRa. Let me know if there was anything I covered that was maybe a bit confusing, or if there was anything that I said was wrong. Definitely always like to be corrected. And that's going to do it for this week. Thank you for sticking around. Stay curious. Cheers.